On a summer day in 1997, 10 French tourists hiked through the world-famous Antelope Canyon, accompanied by an American guide. At first, everything on this hike was going to plan, but halfway in, something very strange happened. 5 of the tourists began to feel this mysterious, unexplainable dread, like deep inside of them. And it wasn't fear of tight spaces, it wasn't nerves, it was something deeper. And so these 5 tourists made the decision to turn around and hike back out of the canyon. And though they didn't know it yet, that single choice would become the best and most important decision of their entire lives. You see, folks, all the way on the other side of the canyon, a hidden threat was brewing in silence. A threat that none of the tourists or their guide ever saw coming. Today, I'm going to be telling you about Antelope Canyon, which is known for being one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And I'm not exaggerating. But with all that said, this is the story of the darkest day in history of this famous canyon. And there's a lot to unpack here, including a pretty wild controversy that adds an entire new dimension to this story. And so be sure to stick around until the end of the video to learn why, even to this day, this story is still incredibly relevant, especially to one particular person. Now, before we take a road trip to Arizona, I just want to take a minute to thank you guys for watching my videos. Like, I should be doing that more. Your support means so much to me. And so if you enjoy my content, we work really hard to bring you these videos every week. Please hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers. We got a long ways to go. So Antelope Canyon is located on Navajo Nation land near the town of Page, Arizona. And what makes this place so special are these giant sandstone walls that have been like sculpted by wind and water over millions of years. The hike goes through these small open air passageways that let just enough sunlight in so it's not fully dark. And it's kind of hard to describe this, but I should just show you some pictures. When you put all that stuff together, you get this, and this, and this. I mean, doesn't that just look incredible? I mean, based on those photos, you can see why it's no wonder that a number of like pretty famous movies were actually shot in Antelope Canyon, like Tree of Life or 127 Hours, although the real story didn't actually happen there. But even before all these movies came out, hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands from all over the world were already coming to Arizona to hike through this insane canyon. And today we're going to focus on a group of people with this very same hope. 10 French tourists had signed up for a tour of Antelope Canyon, and they met their guide at the ticketing station, which was run by the Navajo Nation. Their guide was 28-year-old Francisco Poncho Quintana, who was a construction worker from Los Angeles who also part-timed as a guide for Trek America, a company that specializes in taking European tourists on American adventures like this. Poncho had spent many years of his life hiking throughout the American Southwest. And on top of that, he had earned all the certificates and done all the training that you need to become a guide for Antelope Canyon. And frankly, he knew the canyon inside and out. He'd been through it tons of times before. And if it sounds like I'm kind of gassing up Poncho here, I'm actually not really trying to do that. And so I want to illustrate that Antelope Canyon isn't like this extreme hike. It's extremely beautiful, but it's only about a mile long, or say 1.5 kilometers. It's like 2 hours of hiking at most, and the terrain is actually pretty flat outside of a few wooden staircases and ladders that take you kind of deeper in. And as if this hike doesn't sound any easier, on this particular summer day in 1997, the weather was literally perfect at the entrance of the canyon. Not a cloud in the sky, right? And so these French hikers were feeling pretty good about their odds of snapping some pictures of those famous afternoon sunbeams. And so they confidently headed into the lower Antelope Canyon, following their guide, Poncho. Now, I almost wasn't going to include this right here, but I have to note that there's actually some pretty big controversy around this point in the story, even though we're just at the beginning, pretty much. How do I explain this? Like, it's one that will kind of linger on after the events of the day unfold. But for the sake of building out what these hikers were truly experiencing, like in the moment and experiencing that day, and not to put any hindsight bias on this story, I'm going to hold off on telling you the details of the controversy until I give you, the full context of what actually happened. So the group of French hikers followed Poncho deeper into Antelope Canyon. As he did with his other tours, Poncho would let the group stop, take photos, and he would explain the science and history behind the formation of the sandstone walls. And at this point, Poncho also noticed that he had a few stragglers, we'll call them, kind of forming around him. These hikers who go into the canyon without a guide and then kind of just like eavesdrop into tours to try to get more information. On this particular day, these stragglers were 2 Americans, a Swede, a Brit, and then 2 more French tourists. And they would kind of join Poncho at times for his explanations and then kind of wander off into the canyon and do their own thing. But again, this is normal. Like there was nothing out of the ordinary about this. And so about halfway into the hike, Poncho's group was pretty deep into the narrows of Antelope Canyon. And by narrows, I mean very, very narrows, which I know is not very good English, but I think you get the point, right? The narrows here can be as tight as 3 feet or about 1 meter wide, with towering walls reaching up to 100 feet tall or 30 meters high. For some of you, that probably sounds awesome and epic, but for some of you, that might sound pretty scary. Particularly if you get claustrophobic. And at this point, some of Poncho's clients were starting to get very claustrophobic. And I know for a fact that there's some of you watching this right now, probably not most of you, but certainly some of you who think that this would probably sound like a nightmare to be like in the canyon like this. And so before I lean even more into the nightmare side of things when it comes to this story, I need to just kind of chill things out for a second here and tell you about Aura. Aura is the sponsor of this video, and I just said the word nightmare a bunch of times there. Speaking of nightmares, you know what's genuinely a nightmare? Try Googling your own name. Have you done this? I did this, and boom, there I am on like half a dozen people finder websites. My email, my phone number, even like my previous addresses. It's like all my personal info is just on display at a yard sale. The companies that do this are called data brokers, and they collect and sell your data to marketers, scammers, even stalkers without your permission. And they're making billions doing it. Now, they're technically supposed to remove your information if you ask them, but they also make the process so confusing and drawn out that most people don't even know where to start or just give up entirely. Folks, this is where Aura comes in. I actually use Aura myself, and I recommend it to all my friends and family because Aura deals with these scummy data brokers for you on your behalf. They automatically request your information to be removed from these sites, and they don't just remove it, they keep it off those sites. But Aura is way more than just a data broker remover. It's all-in-one digital security. You get real-time fraud alerts for your bank and credit, 24/7 identity monitoring, plus a VPN, an antivirus, password manager, and even $5 million in identity theft insurance with US-based support 24/7. Using basic security without Aura is like locking your front door but then leaving the back door wide open. But with Aura, it's like locking your front door and your back door and then posting up a very unfriendly guard dog. And folks, that's why I choose Aura, and you can choose it too with a 14-day free trial when you click my link at the top of the description. In those 2 weeks, you're gonna see exactly where your personal data is being exposed and sold. I'm not gonna leave myself vulnerable. You shouldn't either. And so one more time, click that link for your 14-day free trial. And folks, let's get back to this crazy story. So as the hikers kept pushing through the sketchy part of the narrows here, many of Poncho's clients were feeling a bit uneasy, to put it mildly. And trying to be a responsible guide, of course, Poncho listened to the concerns of his group. Half of his tourists just had this like gut feeling that it was a bad idea to continue on. A feeling that some accounts say was not just related to the claustrophobia. Now, maybe it was because of the language barrier between Poncho and the French hikers, but I don't know. Apparently they weren't only feeling like uncomfortable, they were actually feeling something ominous, like something bad was gonna happen if they didn't turn back right now. But Poncho had done this tour of Antelope Canyon many times before, and nothing bad had ever happened to him. And so he was like trying to figure out what they could possibly be so nervous about. But remember, it was literally perfect outside. It was clear blue skies. And the trail wasn't even that crowded by other tourists. And so Poncho tried to convince them to stay, telling them about how beautiful it was going to be if they went lower into the canyon. But ultimately, 5 of the 10 French hikers were beyond ready to leave at this point. And so with Poncho's permission, they began their ascent back out of Antelope Canyon while Poncho and 5 other French hikers continued on along with those random other stragglers around them. Now, I'm sure we've all had those friends who kind of want to bail on an adventure when there's literally no sign of danger. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable or they forgot a snack or something like that. And I don't know. I'd like to think that I'm usually in the camp of kind of just toughing it out or like it's worth it. But this story kind of makes me question that mentality a little bit. And frankly, I think you're going to find the same thing for yourself. Because while everything was relatively chill around where Poncho and his group were, the story is really about what was happening on the other side of the canyon, 15 miles or about 24 kilometers away from where they were. Only a few minutes after those 5 French hikers turned around and left, Poncho felt something change. At first, it was just an instinct that kind of made him freeze up a little bit. You know that feeling when like the hair on the back of your neck stands up, but you're not really sure why. But then he realized that something had shifted in the air. It was wind, which had been calm just a moment before, but now it had suddenly started to pick up a bit, kind of blowing towards them from upstream. The rest of the group didn't catch on to this at first. They were still snapping photos of the canyon, having conversations in different languages, just enjoying what was truly a sunny, gorgeous day in this beautiful spot. But Poncho continued to pay attention to that wind. In fact, he actually did more than that. He prayed that it would stop, but the knot in his stomach tightened because that gust of wind became a constant breeze. And that's when he felt the very same ominous feeling that those other hikers who turned around had felt. Something bad was going to happen. And frankly, it was now go time. Everyone had to run. In this moment, panic ensued. Remember, these hikers were from all different parts of the world, and Poncho didn't have time to explain what he feared was happening, but they all knew what go meant. They all saw the urgency, and so Poncho started running in the opposite direction from where the wind was coming, and all of the other hikers followed him. He was their guide after all. They were very deep into the canyon at this point, having climbed several ladders and stairs to get all the way down to the bottom. And as they ran through the narrow passageways, Poncho heard one of the tourists behind him say that it felt like they were in an Indiana Jones movie. But folks, this was not a movie. This was as painfully real as things can possibly get. So they're running through the canyon, and then all of a sudden they turned a corner and saw off in the distance the ladders that would take them up to safety. But at the very same time, everything around them started to shake. The dirt from the ground started to kind of jump and rattle. The massive sandstone walls of the canyon were kind of like jolting left and right. And that's when Poncho heard a sound. It was like the engine of a jet plane starting low and then getting louder and louder. And Poncho knew exactly what this was. He even took a split second to kind of just take a breath, because he, along with all of the other hikers, were about to face something that is just so insane. And I called it painfully real a second ago, but in this moment, it probably didn't even feel real. Coming directly at them was a giant wall of water, like 30 feet wide by 11 feet deep, or about 9 meters wide by 3 meters deep. Just a massive, massive wall of water. And so, yeah, there's no getting out of the way of that. They didn't have any time to react. No time to get to the ladders or get up to safety. Pretty much in just a split second, everyone had to find something to hold on to, literally hold on to for dear life. But remember, they're in this narrow canyon, and the walls were no help to them, because they were just so smooth. There was nothing to hold on to. They tried and tried, every man for himself, but soon enough, the inevitable disaster struck. One by one, hikers disappeared under the water. Poncho desperately pushed a few of the hikers onto this like small ledge, kind of pinning himself against them to try and keep them above the water. But I mean, it was only a matter of time until that ledge started to become too slippery. And meanwhile, the other hikers were panicking in the rising water, trying to stay afloat and fighting the current. And I don't blame them for doing this, because this was truly fight or flight. But these pretty much drowning hikers were starting to pull onto Poncho and the other few hikers who were on that ledge. And unfortunately, because the force of the river was so strong, the hikers in the water were accidentally pulling the hikers off of the ledge and like down into the water with them. As Poncho sat on the ledge with one final female hiker watching in absolute horror at what was happening, he felt her being pulled by a panicking hiker who was begging them to hold on. And Poncho tried to hold on to her and to the person in the water. They even locked eyes, but unfortunately, the situation was just hopeless. And Poncho realized that the inevitable had arrived. It was time for all of them to be swept down the river. Now, what happened next is most likely the worst few minutes of Poncho's life. He was flung downstream at alarming speed. He was pretty quickly blinded by all the sediment and mud, getting into his eyes. And the thrashing of the water was so strong that it literally stripped his clothing right off his back. Every few seconds, he would bump into a rock or the side of the wall. And because he wasn't clothed anymore, this meant that the skin would just kind of rip right off of him. It was like being in a human washing machine, essentially. But still, and amazingly, Poncho was able to use whatever lessons he had learned from swiftwater training to not drown and to try to just slow himself down any way possible. This meant trying to stay on his back and keeping his feet pointed downstream. So every minute or so, he would get like a precious breath of air before being submerged back under. After 4 whole minutes of being thrown around in the Nightmare Sludge River, Poncho suddenly felt his hand kind of graze a rock. He grabbed it, and this collision turned his body into an eddy that was located behind a waterfall. In that eddy, he was swirling around and around in the water, basically just being ragdolled. And at this point, he had almost given up. Like, he was prepared to drown. He couldn't see anything, and he was in so much pain with open wounds all over his body, bleeding. And so Poncho took one final breath. And to his surprise, for the first time since before the flood began, he breathed a full mouthful of air. Right around the time that half of Poncho's tourists had turned around, a perfect storm had been brewing on the other side of the canyon. Heavy dark clouds started dumping rain right into the drainage system that feeds into Antelope Canyon. And instead of moving through the area quickly like many storms do, those clouds just kind of hung in the air right there, just unleashing all this rain. And again, this happened miles away from where Poncho and his group were at, and so they couldn't see the clouds. They had no idea of the danger that they were in. Hours after this flash flood, a state trooper would end up finding Poncho shivering on a perch on the outer part of the canyon. He was completely naked, he was bleeding, struggling to breathe, and yet somehow he was still alive. That swirling eddy that had almost been a death sentence had actually ended up shooting him out over a waterfall and then out of the grasp of the river. He was thankful to be alive, obviously, as we all would be, but as he was being taken to the hospital, all he could think about was what had happened to the other hikers, the people that he was guiding, the people that he was in at least some sense responsible for. I hate to say it, but the odds of even one person surviving something like this seemed so incredibly low, let alone everyone surviving. And so Poncho feared the absolute worst. Meanwhile, the initial search and rescue efforts were starting back in the canyon and on the river, but they did have to wait almost 24 hours for the water levels to kind of go back down to a safe place, we'll say. And after this happened, the very next morning, a body count started to come in. 9 bodies were recovered. Some were found in the canyon still, while others were found washed miles downstream. Some of them all the way into Lake Powell, which is insane. And Poncho was the only survivor. And immediately after all of this information came out, a media firestorm was ignited. Right away, there was tons of international press, particularly in France, because 7 of the 11 victims were French citizens. One of the most tragic stories that came out in the media was of these 2 young daughters. Their parents were a French couple who had drowned during this tragedy, And their kids were not only left, orphaned now, but that particular day, they were actually waiting in their motel room in Arizona for their parents to return from this hike. That's just brutal, right? And on top of the death toll, 2 people were actually still missing. Their bodies hadn't been found. And when the official search was called off, people were pretty pissed, we'll say. Pretty pissed off at the people in charge. I mean, someone had to be held responsible for this. Someone had to be blamed. It was way too tragic and preventable not to have that happen, right? And so remember that controversy that I mentioned to you at the beginning of the video? It's now time to fill that missing piece in. The Navajo Nation, who, if you remember, operates Antelope Canyon, for lack of a better way to say it, well, they had what they believed was proof of who was at fault here. Apparently, a ticket taker at the entrance of Antelope Canyon reported to the police that before Poncho's group went into the canyon, she had actually warned all of the hikers that day, including Poncho's group, that going into the canyon wasn't recommended due to potential weather forecasts. And she claims that while some groups decided to turn back, Poncho's group went in anyways. Now, it's important to note here that Trek America, the company that hired Poncho, the company he worked for, they denied wholeheartedly that this warning was ever given. And yet, this claim must have sent Poncho into a spiral. I mean, he was already racked with guilt, not just survivor's guilt, which is very real, but also, we'll call it guide's guilt. I mean, again, he was the guide. He was the one, responsible for his clients, you could say. I'm not saying it was like all his fault or anything, but you know what I mean? Like, he was in charge. And so you can probably imagine how hard, being blamed for their deaths would have hit him. Several months after all this happened, a full investigation would come out. And thankfully, it would finally reveal the truth. It's said that when the rain started in the upper part of Antelope Canyon, some tour guides had actually observed a tiny trickle of water coming through, and they had closed it themselves. And as it turns out, there was indeed an official update given to Poncho's group and to all the other hikers that day. But that update was an all clear. It said the weather was fine. Poncho did not defy any orders. Now, I doubt this gave him, a lot of relief, but at least it kind of took some of the heat off of him. And at this point, it was now on the Navajo Nation and local authorities to make sure that something like this never happened again. And so right away, advanced weather monitoring systems were put into place to kind of track flash flood risks. Hikers are now not only warned about floods, but all tours are immediately canceled if there's even a possibility of a storm, even if the sky is clear at the moment. It also became a rule that anyone who went into the canyon had to have a licensed guide, so basically no more stragglers. And all of the wooden ladders and stairs that had broken during the flood were replaced with much sturdier, bolted-in metal staircases. All of these changes were obviously good for the safety of Antelope Canyon, but none of it really helped Poncho. I mean, the first 5 years, 5 whole years after the tragedy were just so rough for him. He was lost, wondering why he was the one chosen to survive. And on the 6th anniversary of the flood, he actually returned to Antelope Canyon. And you might be asking, why would he go back to the place that caused him all of this trauma? And well, it's because he went back to actually restart search efforts for the 2 missing hikers. He said, quote, "I'm still their guide. I will find them and return them to their families so we can all rest at last." And though this was a very noble effort, unfortunately, they did not find those bodies. Actually, to this day, almost 30 years later, they're still missing. So this is almost needless to say, but Poncho, he had to figure out a way to heal from all of this. In 2013, 10 years after he went back to Antelope Canyon to search for those missing bodies, he came out with something really surprising, actually. And it was his debut novel. It's called Breathe For Me, and I have to say it's a pretty amazing book. He goes into detail about the tragedy way more than I did, but so much of the book is also about his past, kind of leading up to it. He talks a lot about growing up in an abusive household, not being taught to help people as a kid, and he talked about how being a guide kind of restored parts of him. And I think after all of this reflection, he was finally able to answer the question of why he was the only one to survive. But even if that doesn't sound interesting to you for some reason, I really encourage you to read this book. Don't just watch this video, but read the book before you truly judge any of his actions on this day. I really, really mean that, because it's such a nuanced situation. I've been doing my best, but it's just so complicated. And so I've linked the book in the description. And again, before you start typing out any mean comments or whatever, I really think you should put your money where your mouth is and read the book and learn the full story. This has obviously been a tough one. Even though I make these videos all the time and tell a lot of tough stories, it never really gets any easier, and that's the case here, especially after the tragic floods that just happened in Texas just a few weeks ago as of the recording of this video. I think both the Texas tragedy and this particular story here from Antelope Canyon just show the power of flash floods and how they really cannot be taken lightly. They can come out of absolute nowhere. And so if you're ever going to be hiking in a canyon, or anywhere for that matter, especially somewhere remote, remember to not just check your weather app, but actually go online and look at real-time weather monitoring data in order to get a full idea of the full forecast for where you're going to be. Now, speaking of those floods in Texas, since this story today was about a flash flood, and since the Texas tragedy is so fresh in my mind, I was actually in like the Austin area when it happened. My give back call out this week is going to be to the Salvation Army's disaster relief fund. I've made a donation to them. I encourage you to do the same, even if it's just a few dollars. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. I've linked their fundraiser in the description, so please check it out. Thank you guys for watching this, and if you liked it, be sure to subscribe, and hey, maybe you'll be interested in watching this one next. And so thank you very much.